at the University at Albany, we say the world within reach. And that could not be more literally true on a daily basis than for our fourth faculty exemplar, Malcolm Russell-Einhorn. Malcolm is director of the Center for International Development, where he oversees a staff of 20 and an annual budget of $15 million per year, annual, devoted to a variety of donor-funded technical assistance and research projects. These include initiatives with over 140 local staff in places like Bangladesh, Bosnia, Afghanistan, Kenya, Uganda, and Lebanon. These efforts focus on parliamentary development, local government reform, civil society engagement, and legal and constitutional reform. Malcolm is also the author of several articles on comparative administrative law and on legal frameworks providing for greater public participation in policymaking and governmental accountability. Malcolm, welcome.
Good evening. My talk tonight is about change in Africa, how big picture trends with the economy, politics, society are changing Africa, but also how they're changing certain institutions, in this case, African parliaments, and increasingly how these parliaments are helping to steer and manage some of these bigger forces and challenges in a positive way. I'm also going to talk about our work at the center, working with the Kenyan parliament in particular, the most advanced parliament in Africa, but also one that might point the way for other parliaments in Africa to reach another higher stage of development. So let's look very quickly at some of these major trends hitting Africa today. First of all, the economy. It used to be that people looked at Africa and said, you know, it's an economic backwater, it's a place of poverty, it's a place of disease. Well, that's changed, and partly it's because of changes within Africa that occurred in the 1990s. There were protests that forced leaders, no matter how autocratic, to change their ways. You had new economic policies put into place, tariff reduction, better tax collection, debt reduction, and the cutting of red tape. And the result today is impressive. You've got growth rates between 5 and 12%. Occurring across the continent. It's not everywhere. There's places still mired in conflict. There's autocrats that haven't changed their ways. But you've got this impressive growth. And to be sure, this story isn't just about commodities. There are people who will say, hey, this is about China, right? China's investing, China's buying, all this foreign direct investment, it's all from China. Not really true. To be sure, 25 to 30% of this is coming from commodities, oil, mining, etc. But a much bigger percentage, 55%, is coming from services, telecommunications, banking, and retail. What about some other trends? Education. Education is changing by the day. You've got primary school enrollment increasing, secondary school enrollment up to 42%. Sounds pretty modest, right? But 30 years ago, that was 10%. University enrollments have doubled in the last decade. And what about technology? Well, you've heard about the growth in services. Well, part of that services is telecommunications. And you've got huge increases in mobile phone subscriptions. There are now 600 million mobile phone subscribers in Africa. That's bigger than in Europe or the United States. You've also got mobile banking, which you may have heard about, where people like this gentleman can actually finance livestock transactions mobily with a cell phone that will allow them to withdraw, transfer, or deposit funds. And computer usage still skyrocketing across the continent. And one noteworthy little soundbite is that just a couple of months ago, IBM announced that it was opening its first computer lab in Nairobi. And it's going to be dedicated to helping solve problems of intragovernment communication, and Nairobi's atrocious traffic jams. Health, HIV infection rates way down. Malaria, the incidence of malaria down 50% in most of the places where it's endemic. And infant mortality also very, very much down. So some of this is being spurred by globalization, to be sure, easier access to information, new technologies. But at another level, at a micro level, it's changing because of the people who have new ways of thinking, new ways of embracing technology, new ways of embracing new policies. These are people in their 20s, 30s, and 40s, and many of them have studied overseas, many of them have worked in the private sector. And an economist from Ghana, George Ayite, several years ago memorably called this group the cheetah generation. And he contrasted this cohort with what he rather uncharitably termed the plodding, complacent, and often harmful hippos that still occupy many positions of power in Africa. And even though people may disagree with this characterization, and even though they may disagree with the depth and scope of change in Africa, no one disputes the power and visibility of the cheetahs. Now, Aita's cheetahs are impatient. They're impatient not only about the economy and breaking down barriers to trade, they're also impatient about governance because they see a lot of African governments as corrupt, slow, unaccountable. And this impatience has produced results. I spoke about those protests in the 1990s. Well, they've continued in a sense. Civil society has become more outspoken. And what you've got now are, according to Freedom House, you've now got fully 2/3 of the African countries branded as free or partly free. This is a huge transformation from 2 decades ago. And these countries themselves have experienced steady increases in democracy scores from the World Bank and from Freedom House. Now you can see in this next slide, T-3, that's before this economic transition and political transition where many countries moved over to multi-party democracy in the early 90s. And of course it varies a little bit by, when in those early 90s the countries reached that stage. But you see 2 years out from transition, 3 years out, 3 to 5 years out, 10 to 12 years out. Who's performing better? It's the democracies. Not the autocracies, not the nominal electoral democracies that don't have entrenched civil and political rights. It's the genuine democracies that are outperforming. Now, to be sure, many of these democracies, people say, well, how do we know they're really better? Look at China, look at Singapore, look at Malaysia. These are authoritarian governments that are providing for their people and sharing a reasonable proportion of their growth. But fundamentally, we know that no matter how committed these leaders might be to expanding the economic pie, democracies, by and large, will face more political pressure to deliver a reasonable level of public goods to their citizens, either by the ballot box or by an open society that allows for civil society pressure. And this pressure obviously comes from different sources. It comes from checks and balances within the government, or it does come ultimately from civil society and a free media. And one of those checks and balances are parliaments. And here are the 4 major functions, just to remind you of what parliaments do. Now, in Africa, we know that only a handful of the parliaments actually robustly perform these 4 roles. Ghana, Kenya, South Africa, Nigeria, Uganda, and to a lesser extent, Botswana, Tanzania, and Benin. And these are, by and large, the parliaments that we work with or have worked with over the years at the Center for International Development. We've had experiences with 12 countries since 1992. And what are the common traits that these legislatures have in common? by and large, they do have a reform coalition within them that we can work with, a group that's committed to reform. I'd like to call this, for the sake of convenience, they have a high cheetah quotient. These people are exerting lots of influence. They're pressing for better resources, better pay, and they're not afraid to conduct aggressive oversight of the executive branch. Now, many hippos, to continue the George Aite metaphor, they can't keep up with the cheetahs in the parliament. But at the same time, out of self-interest, they see what's happening institutionally in terms of these improvements in working conditions, and they do form these reform coalitions. And it's these coalitions, numbering 10 to 15%, that's all it takes to change the tenor and the leadership in these parliaments, because these are the activists, these are the people who lead. I mean, if you look at our US Congress, right, it's always a handful of 20 to 30 in the House who are steadfastly caucusing on the major issues, authoring key legislation, and are the power brokers. So that's not so unusual. So what do we do with these coalitions? Well, obviously, training, technical assistance in a number of different subject matters. We conduct study tours. Most of all, and the thing that I think we're most proud of, is we facilitate knowledge sharing outside the parliament. So we facilitate the ability of experts from outside to mentor, exchange information with the parliamentarians, and create a thoughtful environment for policy reform. And again, how do we do it? We do it with local staff. There aren't many Americans in the mix ever, and certainly not now in Africa, never mind many of the other places we work around the world. And again, to continue the metaphor, we have our own stable of cheetahs. We absolutely have people who can keep pace with the people we work with in the parliament. So what does this work look like up close, and why does it make a difference? I'm going to now shift over to Kenya as an exemplar of what we do and why, at least in some of these environments, you have the right ingredients for success. We've worked in Kenya for 13 continuous years, which in the international development business is highly unusual, because you have donors who tend to be fickle, who tend to put out solicitations to work for 4 years, and then they stop. And then there's a hiatus, maybe they pick it up back again, but there's this discontinuity that's very unhelpful when it comes to sustained engagement. So what's happened in Kenya over the past decade, and why was it a promising place back in 2000 when we first got involved? Well, you did have already a vibrant Kenyan civil society and a free press, a very aggressive free press. You had a parliament that was already committed to a reasonably strong degree of oversight. Throughout the early 2000s, there were multiple scandals uncovered by not just the press, but principally by the parliament. And that burnished its reputation, gave them the fuel to ask really for more resources and more power. But the single thing that was most important was they were able to get a constitutional amendment becoming an independent branch of government. Not a branch that had to come hand in hand to the Ministry of Finance and ask for money, but as in most countries that are full democracies, they have their own budget, their own staff, and their own agenda. And you had this expansion of resources that resulted in growth of the institution, more sophistication, higher salaries. What does that do? It attracts more talented individuals, more cheetahs, so to speak. But the single biggest thing in recent years has been these standing orders or rules reform. This reform really has been tremendously influential. Let's start with the budget. The Kenyan budget used to be delivered to the parliament by the Ministry of Finance, and basically it was, here it is, go approve it, and let's move on. Well, that changed. These new rules required the government to submit an economic justification for the budget, as well as macroeconomic assumptions about the budget. And we helped set up a budget analytical unit in the Kenyan Parliament to allow them to do this, and I'm proud to say that, and this isn't just a costly white elephant, they're one of the 4 parliaments in the world that has a macroeconomic forecasting tool, which they are using successfully. They were inspired by our Congressional Budget Office, and only Canada, Korea, and the US, aside from Kenya, use this. Committees were expanded. There were no subject matter committees in the year 2000. Imagine conducting legislative business without committees. If you don't have committees, you don't have specialization, you don't have analytical depth, you can't go toe-to-toe with the executive. Committee sessions were also, got ahead of myself there, committee sessions were also open to the public. So again, more transparency. And maybe the most interesting and influential thing was that broadcast capability, thanks to us, was installed at the Parliament so that you can have live TV and radio broadcast of parliamentary sessions. And this really captivated the public. It was the first time they had been able to really understand and not have it be mystified what their elected representatives were doing, and in some cases just how poor some of these folks were performing, including the ministers. So you see greater analytic capability in the Parliament, attracting more people with higher education. Up to 61% now of MPs now have a university degree. Major legislation, the capacity to not just pass, but to amend and write their own legislation, up from 17 pieces of major legislation to 40 last year. Private member bills, these are bills introduced not by the government, but by individual members of Parliament. Only 2 in 2006, we had 19 last year. I spoke about the openness of Parliament, creating more interchange between civil society and parliamentarians. You have this quantification of formal interaction either by testimony or written submissions to committees. But the real coup de grace, so to speak, is just in the past couple of years with the passage of the new 2010 Constitution. This really was a mandate from the public. There was pressure for a new constitution. This had been talked about really for about a decade. And the idea was to further democratize the country, devolve governance to the local level as much as possible, and to really combat some of the key inequities and inequalities in Kenyan society. So with this burst of sort of official imprimatur from the people as a whole via this constitutional ratification in 2010, even further progress was made in showing really the impact of Parliament on Kenyan society. And I'll just give you a couple of sound bites here. I mean, one of them was that the budget, just to carry forward the budget discussion, last year, the Kenyan Parliament discovered or was able to reprioritize $171 million of funds that the executive had sort of said, you know, take our word for it, we need these spending priorities. It also impounded several million dollars of funding earmarked for the Attorney General's office due to evidence of corruption and misappropriation. Women's health, we supported the development of a gender-responsive budgeting tool, budgeting guidelines, and trained MPs in its use. And as a result of that, shocking disparities in women's health funding were discovered. The Parliament rectified that by putting more dollars back in. Food security, a comprehensive national food security program was approved by the Parliament and put into law. And also, thanks to collaboration again with outside experts, we were able to help the Parliament create a climate change authority to deal proactively with climate change problems in the future. So, let's look to that future, and the question is this a unique case? Is Kenya just such a good performer, so out of the league with other African democracies that, that other countries are going to take a long time to echo this? Well, to some extent, that's true. Kenya really is somewhat unique in terms of that civil society vibrancy and the political competition that's pretty tough. You don't necessarily find that sort of bare-knuckled competition in some of the other countries. But there are lots of commonalities as well, which give hope to some of these other parliaments like Ghana and Nigeria. Let's just go down the list of those ingredients here before we close. First of all, you have to have a vibrant civil society and a strong media to keep the parliament on its toes. You do need good political competition, again, to keep the parties on their toes and not allow for a monopoly or a kind of collusion to develop. You need a large entrepreneurial and impatient business community also knocking at the door and saying, we need to change things. And finally, within the parliament and outside the parliament, you need a solid cadre of cheetahs, so to speak, to move in the direction of reform, even if it's with a handful of these hippos who, let's be honest, they can sometimes be found wearing some ill-fitting cheetah disguises. But the strongest commonality that has not been exploited by most of these countries is the voting system. In other words, these countries, many of them with British heritage, British colonial heritage, have single-member districts. That means you stand for election as an MP in a district. You have to face the voters, and you have to put your record on the line. That's not true in the Francophone countries and many of the other countries, including, surprisingly, South Africa. They have proportional representation. So there's a slate of candidates. They may not, especially with transportation costs and difficulties being high, they may not get out to their rural districts in particular and really work on constituency development. So one of the things that's happened over the last several years is you have much more attention paid to not only serving constituency needs, which can frankly be a bit daunting in many of these countries, but you educate the population about what they can expect. Not that they can expect pork to be flowing back to their counties endlessly, but that they will represent their views in a common forum for the common good, and some of that will flow back to these constituencies in the form of better women's health allocations, better food security, et cetera. So our work in Kenya is the product of a long and fruitful partnership, and our center has been very much discreetly in the background. I think, again, one of the great things we've been able to do is allow for thoughtful study of policy options. You know, again, connecting Parliament from outside so it isn't this sort of closed shop. And we remain hopeful that this common constellation of forces propelling change in Kenya and the long-term partnership to nurture it, if the donors are willing to think in longer range terms, gives hope for the future that some of these other countries can follow in our wake. Thank you.